Good morning and welcome everyone as we continue our celebration of Spiritual Care Week. Today's webinar, We All Have Stories to Tell, Case Study Research for Chaplains. I'm Andrew Andreska, Project Coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. Some housekeeping instructions off the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding the audio or visual, please feel free to type those into the chat box located in the control panel. You will also have an opportunity to submit text questions to our panelists by typing your questions into the questions pane in that same control panel, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the event. And with that, I'd like to introduce both Jeanne Wirpsa, who's the research chaplain at the Department of Spiritual Care at Northwestern Memorial and their clinical ethicist, as well as Cate Desjardins, the Executive Director of the Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship, Mennonite Chaplains Association. Jeanne,
Welcome everyone. I too am really thrilled to be here to celebrate Spiritual Care Week with you. I'm hoping I can forward these slides. They don't seem to be moving. There we go. Along with my colleague Cate. Let me just say one thing about why it is that I am here presenting on this topic along with Cate. I am the author of a case study and the editor for a book of case studies on chaplains' role in medical decisions making, which I will refer to later. I'm also one of the co-conveners for the Transforming Chaplaincy Research Network that looks at chaplaincy functions. Among those is case study research. Cate.
And I am so glad to be here with you, Jeanne, really who I met through conversations around case studies. I think that's really where our professional relationship began. And I am also the convener of the Pediatric Spiritual Care Research Network through Transforming Chaplaincy. I was a Transforming Chaplaincy Fellow and was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital for 5 years before taking my role with Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship. I also will be the editor of a book of case studies that has just been accepted. It's a book of pediatric case studies, chaplaincy case studies in pediatric spiritual care. So we look forward to that.
Congratulations. So the goals of our webinar today are as follows. We hope to highlight important work that's been done to date, case studies and research materials. We would also like to make a case for more cases, especially in gap areas or themes that have been identified as needing more attention. As Cate has so wisely said, we have no shortage of actual opportunities, right, and cases, right? What we have a shortage of is confidence to do the writing and take that writing to the next level for publishing. So we hope to demystify some of that process. And then finally, we hope to also engage groups of researchers and provide skills for you to analyze existing case studies, a whole nother project that really we're about ready to do given the number of studies that we have. Our time today, how we will spend it, is outlined for you here. Please again remember to add comments and questions at any time along the way. You don't have to wait till the end in the questions box. And Cate will begin us off.
Our first slide and our first topic is really why case studies. If you've been around chaplains in the last few years, if you've been at all kind of around transforming chaplaincy and some of the work we're doing, you've heard about case studies a lot because it's something that we're spending a good amount of energy on. And then the question is, why? If you look at this pyramid, I always think it reminds me of the food pyramid that I hear is now retired. But growing up, I was always told that bread and pasta is that bottom of the pyramid, those carbs that you're supposed to have the most of. Again, I think there may be a reason that that pyramid is now retired. As my childhood self who loved cereal and bagels, I loved it. And I like to think of case studies as the bread and pasta of something we call our pyramid of evidence. So in chaplaincy and in the people who research chaplaincy, whether that's chaplaincy researchers, chaplain interventionists who are doing chaplaincy day to day, but who are allowing their records to be used by researchers through this process, we are trying to build our field and build the evidence base for our field to essentially say what we do is not just, oh, what we feel like doing in this moment, but what we do is actually built on solid evidence-based medicine, evidence-based chaplaincy, and we make a real contribution to our patients, to our colleagues, and to the wider world of healthcare. And in order to do that, we need to build that evidence. And so this pyramid is our pyramid of evidence. Systematic reviews are at the very top, and this is a type of paper that looks at all the other papers on a topic in a very systematic and controlled way and synthesizes that evidence. Below that is randomized controlled trials. So this is what you might have heard about even way back in high school, where you have sort of placebo here with group 1 and the real medicine with group 2, and they compare those kinds of things, and it's all randomized. Obviously, in chaplaincy, we're not necessarily using placebos. I'm not quite sure. Nobody has invented a placebo chaplain yet, but we have ways of doing even randomized controlled trials in chaplaincy, and we do have a few of them now. Below that are cohort studies, which is where you take a group of people and study them over the long term, and then case control studies. And below that is kind of this bread and pasta, which are case series or case reports. Jeannie's going to talk more about case series and why when we talk about case studies, it's not just the single case study we're necessarily looking for, although we need those single case studies in order to build the field. So these case studies are vital for building the field of chaplaincy and chaplaincy research, for understanding what is it that we're doing when we're with a patient at the bedside, or with a group of patients, or with a staff member, or in an outpatient setting. What are we doing? What difference are we making? They're also vital for the education of chaplains and our non-chaplain healthcare colleagues to understand what we're doing. I also think case studies are so important for chaplains because we actually have learned the skills to do this in our training. We write these verbatims along with their theological and personal reflections. And in a case study, the core of it is often a verbatim. It's essentially sharing what we did with the patient. Sometimes that's narrative form. Sometimes that is the dialogue form that most of us have done in our chaplaincy residencies. And so the fact that this is a skill that if you're watching this and you've been through a unit of CPE, you have actually built most of the skills needed to write an effective case study. We need a large number of case studies to understand themes and patterns. That's why this is at the base of our pyramid, because we need a large number of them. We need more of them than we necessarily need those randomized controlled trials to build the field. They're a really excellent entry point for research hesitant chaplains, largely because, again, we have the skills already. They're very narrative based. There's not necessarily statistics involved. You don't need to understand what a chi-square analysis is and all of these things. And what's really important here is case studies and reports are an accepted form of evidence in the medical field. So it may feel to us like we're writing a verbatim or writing a story, but these truly are an important form of evidence. If you open up the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, you will find case reports. These are an important part of the medical field, and this puts us on playing ground with our colleagues. Next slide, Jeannie. So what do we have in terms of case studies? We now have 4 books of case studies. The first book, Spiritual Care and Practice, Case Studies in Spiritual Care. Each of those contains a number of case studies on a particular theme or in a particular clinical setting, and then some responses. We then have Jeannie's book, along with Karen Puglier's, that looks specifically at how chaplains are partners in medical decision-making. So it looks at one very particular phenomenon, asks the chaplains to write case studies, and also does some analysis, which Jeannie's going to talk about later. And then we have Renske Kruisinga's book, along with colleagues in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, they've actually had a longer process of writing case studies. It's called the Dutch Case Studies Project, where lots of chaplains have been writing case studies in groups together. We replicated this in a very small way in the Pediatric Spiritual Care Research Group this past year, and we had small groups of chaplains writing case studies and workshopping those case studies with one another. And this book talks about the learning from that project and also how we learn from case studies in aggregate. So not just the individual case, but what do we do then when we have a body of cases? And Jeannie's going to talk more about that later as well. We will, of course, also have a 5th book of pediatric case studies, hopefully coming out sometime in 2023. What do we already have? We already have a number of chaplaincy case studies in pediatrics. Both of the first 2 books, Case Studies in Spiritual Care and Spiritual Care in Practice, do include pediatric case studies. We have case studies exploring how chaplains are involved in psychiatric care. We have case studies of chaplains involved with veterans. We have case studies of chaplains leading rituals. Now, for this one, I say the caveat. What we don't have is a case study of a chaplain leading many different kinds of rituals. We don't have Eucharist, we don't have baptism, we don't have all of these things. And then, ideally, we need to have 8 case studies of different chaplains leading Eucharist and communion at the bedside in different ways, so we can understand what are the deeper things that chaplains are doing when they're responding to that need. What's the professional expertise that's brought to that? So we have a few case studies of chaplains leading rituals, but like many of these areas, just because we have a few, there's definitely room for more. We have case studies in palliative care. We now have a book of chaplain case studies in medical decision making. And again, even though we have a whole book, I'm sure Jeannie could say that we still need more. We have case studies that explore narrative theory as a way that chaplains do their work. And then we also have a response about that. Daniel Grossamy wrote a response to a case study. So sometimes case studies also spark dialogue in our professional journals and places. And I think that's a really powerful function as well. We do have a case of chaplain care for transgender individuals, and most, but not all, of our case studies that are currently published focus on inpatient hospital-based care. We don't have that many case studies in outpatient care. So, case studies are not just about the case in and of itself, but they really are a research methodology to understand the field of chaplaincy. They're a way of building a body of evidence, generating data about insights, information, theories of chaplaincy, hypotheses for what chaplains do. And out of the case studies, there's so much we can do with them. They can become sort of the basis of larger quantitative and qualitative studies. And I think that that's one of the powerful pieces of case studies. In and of themselves, they're an accomplishment. If you're a chaplain who's published a case study, that is a really important career milestone, I would say, for the chaplains I know who've done that. But beyond that, it's a way of building the wider field. We have lots of types of case studies. Most chaplaincy case studies fall into this bucket of intrinsic. These are case studies that are really about the case in and of itself. They represent primarily this case, this moment. It's a case that can go very deep. And again, this is part of the joy of a case study, is it can get really deep into that case to really try to understand, what did the chaplain do? What did the patient need? What were the interventions? And this is where the researcher, whether that's the writer or the reader of the case, wants to gain insight into one unique situation. And in this case, case studies are not generalizable. Because we have a published case study where, say, a chaplain worked with someone around a fear of death, and ultimately that fear of death was somewhat resolved to the point where that patient was able to be more compliant with their treatment regimen, say, we can't then read that case and say, great, so if every chaplain in our hospital worked specifically with patients on a fear of death, then they would all be more compliant with their treatment. That's not how case studies work. We can say that that's what worked in that individual case, but they're not necessarily generalizable. Instrumental cases represent a little bit more of a general common phenomenon. These can still be a single case, but they explore various factors of the phenomenon, and they can focus on an issue or concern using one bounded case to illustrate this issue. An example of this is in the upcoming pediatrics case study book. We know that we want a case that very deeply explores the issue of non-accidental pediatric trauma, otherwise known as child abuse. We're not actually looking for a very specific case. We're looking for something that really deals with this larger question on the whole, and we'll find a case that is able to explore that phenomenon through the chaplain's work with a family in that. So most of our cases are descriptive. They describe what happens. They can also be explorative, where again, they provide an understanding of the case against the background of its context. Cases can use fieldwork. They can use data collection. Cases can even involve some quantitative measures. And sometimes these explorative cases are considered a prelude to social research. And then explanatory causal cases interpret a phenomenon to the point of answering the question of why on a theoretical basis. And very few, if any, of our published chaplaincy case studies get to this place of explanatory causal, but it's maybe somewhere we want to explore. Considerations in case studies. In the way that I outlined the cases that we already have above, I did so through clinical setting primarily. I said we have so many cases in pediatrics, we have cases in psychiatry, we have cases in veterans care. This is often the way that we categorize the cases that we have and the way we do care. When people ask me, sometimes they say, are you a chaplain? I tend to respond, I'm a pediatric chaplain. We categorize ourselves in these ways. So cases can be in a huge variety of clinical settings. And I also said one of the areas that we are lacking in cases and really want to build some of this is outpatient, cases of chaplaincy care in the outpatient setting. You can also think of cases by medical features. So a case of a chaplain working with someone who has an early Alzheimer's diagnosis, whether that's early onset, so quite young, or someone who's not early onset, but is in the early phases of Alzheimer's. How does a chaplain work in those particular situations? What about in the case of pregnancy complications? What about in the cases of bullet wounds in the ER? So we can think in terms of medical features or clinical features as well. We can also think in terms of intervention types. So Jeanne's book was focused on chaplains as partners in medical decision-making. Now, I would also say within that, there's still many different interventions that a chaplain could use while working with a family on medical decision-making. So we can look at cases based on very particular interventions. So in pediatrics, for instance, we might say, what cases are out there that specifically look at how a chaplain uses spiritual play or godly play with young children as a part of their intervention? Why are they using that intervention? And we can look at it that way. We also have the chaplain characteristics. What's the religion or non-religious orientation of the chaplain? So it could be a case really about how a Buddhist chaplain approaches late-stage cancer care. And you'll see how these considerations start to get mixed. Almost every case study encompasses all of these in kind of a different matrix. I sometimes think of it as a dartboard that kind of intersects, and you're locating your case somewhere in there. You also have patient characteristics. What's the religious orientation or non-religious orientation of the patient? Maybe it's a Buddhist patient who's bringing that into their cancer care, and a Roman Catholic chaplain. How does that work? What does that actually look like in practice? The gender identity of the patient, the age of the patient, all of these pieces. It can also include relevant just background experiences. Maybe that's a patient with a profound medical trauma history. And that's something that really brings this case to light and says, oh, that's something that I think is important for the chaplain to explore in this case. We also have a division between what we call extraordinary care and ordinary or best practice care. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky definition because many things that maybe the non-chaplaincy world thinks of as quite extraordinary can actually be a part of our daily practice. And so what this distinction is a little bit hard to do, but I might put something such as, for instance, our non-accidental pediatric trauma case is going in our extraordinary care section of the book. Most pediatric chaplains have faced this, have had to deal with a case in which there was child abuse. So it's not so extraordinary within, And yet it's not something we necessarily do every single day, thank goodness. And so it isn't quite our ordinary care. So what's been your most sort of typical way of doing care? And that would be ordinary practices. So you want to write a case. The first thing to do is to read a whole bunch of cases. Read within the case studies in chaplaincy. I also encourage you to look at case studies in other fields as well, in social work, in speech language pathology, just to see the forms, to see the ways that people write about their work and how they focus on the profession. Once you've read plenty of case studies, gotten an idea for the types of forms that you might work with your writing style, I think a really important piece is moving away from thinking that you're writing a verbatim. It's not really about the chaplain in the same way as a verbatim is. A verbatim is a tool for self-awareness, and certainly writing a case can foster self-awareness in that process and foster a certain new level of professionalism. But the case itself is really not so much about you as the individual chaplain as it is about the profession of chaplaincy. In the Dutch case study project, they actually write and discuss cases in a cohort group. And when they write the case, they cannot use I language. They can only use the chaplain. So even if I'm writing about myself, I would say the chaplain entered the room. The chaplain did this. And then when they're talking about it in a group, they continue to use that language so that it's not so personal, because the goal is really to explore what is working in terms of chaplaincy practice, not necessarily where could I have done better. Yes, that comes with the case study writing, but I think it really helps us to get out of that verbatim mode and then give a really honest picture of what's happening and explore the wider dynamics. It's about what chaplains do. How did the patient's needs shape our care? And then assessments, interventions, and outcomes. So one way to start, if you want to write a case, is to think, what was the most typical case you have worked recently? What made it so? Can you capture in that case from the beginning of meeting the patient, or maybe even the beginning of getting the referral, towards the resolution of the case, whether that was discharge, whether that was a ritual to sort of summarize and end the relationship, whatever it was, or passing off to another chaplain or provider? Can you capture what you did and why you did what you did as the chaplain? And if you're seeking a case, I always say it's a fun exercise to start from scratch. Decide that one of the cases you begin today, or maybe today or tomorrow, depending on your caseload, is going to be a case study for you. That doesn't mean it has to be a case study you submit to the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy, but it will be a case study you practice writing. Take very careful notes. Seek permission from the patient or family when the time is right if you do decide to publish it. And whatever happens in the visit you do today or tomorrow, in subsequent visits, all of that is evidence for your case. And so start really thinking about, what are those patient needs? How's it shaping my care? And writing those narratives after your visits and seeing how it fits together. Next slide, please. Other nuts and bolts of writing a case study. You make sure that you carefully include the context for the case. These were all of those considerations I was lining up earlier. Should include information about the patient or their family, illness, the reason for choosing this case, and that can be a very personal reason. It's okay to name that. Say, I had a sibling with this disease, and so I was really drawn to this case, and there was something in me that was intrigued by this. That's still teaching us about chaplaincy as a profession, because it's teaching us a little bit about how we do our case finding, and gives us something to talk about. A biographical outline of the chaplain providing care that includes your location, physical, any biases you may have, the institution you're with, and your experience level. And in the narrative, describe the history, focus on significant moments and interventions. It's okay, unlike maybe in a verbatim you would do for CPE, it's okay to cut out the small talk. It's okay to focus on the main interventions, the main moments that you think are relevant to the case, and include verbatim accounts of these important conversations. I also have seen cases that include short paragraph narratives that do maybe include some dialogue, but isn't necessarily chaplain-patient, chaplain-patient. And then you need to write the reflection. Write about what assessment model did you use, or did you not use an assessment model? What interventions did you choose, and what do you think the outcomes were? Why do you think those are the outcomes? Did the patient tell you those were the outcomes? Did you bring in a survey to the patient? Did the social worker tell you they were the outcomes? All of those pieces. Make sure you include any conceptual frameworks that you're using. That could be narrative medicine, narrative theology, theories of grief, family systems literature. And if a case study is on a particular area of chaplaincy care, you have all these options. We also need case studies on interprofessional team dynamics, so it might seem a little bit surprising that we should be writing cases about our staff care, but especially with the explosion of staff care during COVID, this is another area where we have a lot of opportunities. Name if there's a themed topic to your case, such as cross-cultural care, use of rituals, and really reflect on that practice and outcomes. And I'll add 2 cents, which is what if you decide then, I have a case, I think this makes a contribution to the chaplaincy literature, and I think I want to submit it to a journal or a book. From that point, I would really encourage people to use their colleagues as readers, as discussion partners, use your supervisors as readers and discussion partners. They can also help you with this next piece, which is the ethics. Do very thorough editing, and from there, you can submit it. Read carefully the journal you're trying to submit to, read their guidelines in terms of word length. Some of the journals are 3,000 words, some of them are 6,000 words. 3,000 makes a good amount of sense for a case study. 6,000 tends to be a longer research report. So in terms of ethics, obviously we are trying to protect patient and family privacy. We remove all HIPAA identifiers, social security numbers, URLs, medical record numbers. These aren't necessarily to appear, and we do absolutely change names. We often change specific ages, especially if it doesn't necessarily change the sense of the case. We do not include data that is smaller than a state level. So generally, we don't name the institution where the care was provided, and we'll kind of say, I often say things like in a pediatric hospital in the Midwest. Is sometimes what I'll use. Maybe I'll use the phrase like tertiary or quaternary to make it clear that the level of care is very high in terms of acuity, but I'll do it that way. Certainly change the names of religious congregations. I've had a lot of fun, actually. I did some research where the patient felt it was very important that the name of their church was a part of the record. And when I wanted to publish that, I had to come up with a name that gave the same sense, because it was very particular and very interesting, but definitely was not the same thing. And so that sometimes you have to be creative. And any details about the patient's health condition and course of treatment. We will change details here. It's not so much creative license as protection. We'll also obscure case details by adding extraneous material. Sometimes we add a few details that weren't there, just again to kind of protect the patient, and build composites of 2 or more cases. Again, when this is about the chaplaincy care, it's not necessarily about the sort of perfect historical accuracy. That certainly is something that is an option. And then asking patient and family permission. Consent of patient and family is not required to publish case studies. However, there is emerging consensus for the profession that it is a good idea for the author to seek patient and family permission to publish their story whenever possible. A great example of this is Daniel Grossany's case study. I believe in the first case study book, he works with a young girl named Leanne, and he does ultimately ask her and her family's permission to publish the case. And he reports very clearly that they read the case, they asked for certain things to be removed and not included, and they asked for, I think, something else to be included. And so he reports, that's what I did. I honored their requests, and this is the case that's before you. And so giving your patients and families some opportunity for that. It's also another intervention, potentially, another way to provide care. And so we certainly encourage that.
Thank you, Cate. I hope that those of you who are listening in today feel not only empowered and as if you have some skills to begin this process, but maybe even excited about it. I think we've all had fun doing it. And although it is a lot of work, I think it can be incredibly satisfying and can deepen our sense of professional kind of satisfaction and competency as well. So I'm going to shift the focus for a moment and return to one of the things that Cate mentioned at the beginning, which is not only are cases written so that we can see in this case, what is it that happened? What do we know about what this chaplain did with this particular patient, why they use this kind of intervention, but they can actually serve as data themselves to answer other questions. They can serve as a body of evidence, right? A single case narrative, right, describes and explains a phenomenon sufficiently and adequately according to its uniqueness and completeness. It is research in and of itself, but we can have cases serve purposes beyond themselves. So Cate mentioned instrumental case studies. So again, this bounded case, right, can serve a secondary interest of, again, facilitating understanding of something other than the case itself. And if we had multiple cases that were instrumental around the same topic, we would start to have a fuller picture of that phenomenon and maybe an answer to the question that we're asking. These same cases, these instrumental cases, can actually be used to generate, modify, and critique some of our assumptive frameworks. They can be used to build theories. Now, our social science colleagues actually do this on a very large scale. They will do multiple case studies, comparative, looking at children's classrooms and a certain kind of model of teaching, but this large classroom, that one, another one. They will look at political movements and compare them with a lens for a certain kind of process or ideology that is present to see whether, again, that assumption that they've made about that process holds up in the actual light of these cases. We're probably not at the point of doing those on a larger scale like that, but for right now, we are doing it with individual cases. So I'd like to use the example of our book, which you see here, not to promote it, though it is really good, to focus, which focuses on a particular care within chaplaincy, right? As we talked about the role of chaplains in supporting decision-making. So while each case in this volume is bounded unto itself, and was not put into dialogue with the other cases as they were being developed, the case itself was illustrative. It was used to illustrate a larger issue or phenomenon. What is the role of chaplains in medical decision-making? And we actually used these cases then to come into conversation with other data points that we had, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I just again have showed you the structure of the book. Cases were divided under this particular aspect of chaplain's role in decision making, supporting or outlining patient's values, making sure the patient as the person was included in the conversation, addressing the emotions of the family that or of the patient that impacted medical decision making, resolving family dynamics, and looking at religious and negotiating religious and cultural differences. This is not exhaustive for the ways in which chaplains support medical decision-making, at least not according to the previous research that we have done. There are other areas that we could have covered in this book. So we're not claiming that these cases presents a full picture of the phenomenon of how chaplains provide support for medical decision-making, but it does offer some insight. In addition to the respondents in our book, we have psychologists, palliative care physician, who did their own reflection and analysis of subsets of the cases of the 3 sections each, right? Our intention was actually from the start to analyze these cases even further in conversation with one another, to do cross-case analysis and with other kinds of research on the topic. So we've begun to do that, and I want to share a little bit of that process for you, because I think it also gives you insight if you're now trying to take a look at some of the cases that have been published. How might I begin to approach them in a cross-case analysis? So obviously, we are going to bring an interpretive lens to the project, to the cases that we choose. We're going to bring some theoretical propositions to test out and to see what these cases yield. So in our case, we want to look at how does integration into the IDT facilitate the chaplain's role in medical decision-making, which requires us to delve further and say, okay, in these cases, how was the IDT structured? What role did the chaplain play? So to describe those components. We also want to bring to this set of cases a question of how does chaplain promote value concordant care? We argue that the chaplain does promote value concordant care or patient-centered medical decision-making. Is that true or not? And if so, what does that look like? So we're both doing a descriptive and a causal analysis of these cases. So we're going to look at patterns, right, within the cases. We're going to lift up domains. We're going to notice some outliers, right, once we've extracted relevant sections of text to see whether that challenges our presupposition. Notice this is a kind of qualitative analysis that, for those of you who know qualitative analysis, is not grounded theory. We're not just looking at the cases and trying to lift up all the themes. We are excluding some themes, excluding some rich data that each of those cases provides in order to learn something else and to test our presuppositions. So we decided, as I said, to highlight sections to look at two theoretical presuppositions. What is it about the integration of the chaplain into the medical team, to the interdisciplinary team that facilitates medical decision-making? What's the role? What are those preconditions? How does communication happen? What kind of authority or leadership does the chaplain exercise? So we identified these preconditions in the set of cases that we had. It seemed to us, by again doing this kind of back and forth, looking to see what are those preconditions, that the length of service and trust established made a difference, that the chaplains involved who were most effective had legitimacy from spending extended time getting to know the patient and family. We also paid attention to the kind of referral sources, the mode of communication, to again give us some insight into what it is that facilitates the chaplain in this role of medical decision-making. We also looked and paid attention then specifically with this lens to what kind of authority or leadership or initiative did chaplains play. And some of the question about what initiative chaplains take, are they proactive or just kind of wait to be invited to the table, came out of another study that we had done. So remember I said in this kind of multiple case cross-case comparison, we're often referencing other data, other studies that have been done to help us then say, do these cases confirm that, or do they potentially call into question those other studies that have been done, those presuppositions that we have made? And then we paid attention with this lens of what was absent in these cases that made for success, that had appeared in other studies as actual barriers to chaplains being able to facilitate medical decision-making, to have a place at the table, and to be effective in that role. So that's a descriptive moment, right? So in terms of value concordant care, we wanted to actually look a slightly bit more causally. So we want to argue, the presupposition is chaplains, the involvement of the chaplain promotes value concordant care. Narratives, as we know, are longitudinal. They unfold over time, which is why case studies actually help us look at this cause and effect, helps us look at processes as they unfold, which is why we try to tie together an intervention with an outcome, right? What was the intervention that the chaplain used to pay attention to values, to identify those, and what did it actually lead to? Value concordant decision making or care. For those of you not familiar with the term value concordance, again, basically it's saying we are aligning the care plan with who this patient is, what matters to them. Now, one of the interesting things that we discovered was that, again, not only did the chaplain pay attention to who this person is, what matters to them, but they also, in terms of promoting value concordant care, identified an approach to medical decision-making more generally that helped the team and a timing for that decision-making. They also helped move the process along so that decision-making could be restored when it became stalled. Things that are often not included in the literature itself on value concordant care. And then more than anything, what showed up was that value concordant decision-making, it's not a static thing. It's not like we come up with one advanced directive that says, I care about X, and we go in and make sure that that's respected. We, in our role, hold in tension competing values, as one of our writers said, until our patients or families can find a version that they can live with. So again, we're also contributing to our understanding of how value concordant care is represented. And we've seen this in other analyses of case studies, in particular that done by Steve Nolan, that it was the person or the therapeutic presence of the chaplain themselves that underlied or kind of supported this ability to see the patient as a person, to attend to the emotions, to appreciate the cultures, and thereby facilitate or promote value concordant care. What is interesting, and again, this is the next step in analyzing case studies and having them contribute additional data, right, is that what we found here in terms of the chaplain's role, the understanding of the interprofessional team, was that it lines up what the literature out there, a robust set of literature, tells us about conditions for interprofessional collaboration. That there needs to be a shared vision of decision-making style, that there needs to be an understanding and appreciation of others' roles, that we need tools to communicate, that we need some continuity and kind of overlapping, continuity of relationships, overlapping of those roles. That the chaplain or whomever else is involved, there needs to be some symmetry to, again, power dynamics. So again, in this process, as you can see, we're going beyond this individual case for its richness, what it can tell us as something in and of itself to illuminate a phenomenon larger than itself. Now, I'm arguing in this value concordant example that we actually have a causal moment, right? That we're looking at cause and effect. When we turn to some of the literature on case study analysis, they tell us that we actually need to consider what are called rivals. So we need to do some internal validity testing if we're going to argue that it was the chaplain who caused this movement and caused the values, the care plan to be aligned, or the decision to be aligned with patient values. So again, in the literature, and this is where I highly, highly, highly suggest you work with your social science colleagues if you want to do this level of case study analysis. There are many different kinds of rivals, potential rivals. So we're just starting this process. We haven't looked at these yet, but there is something called a commingle rival, which I want to talk about. So perhaps it was another intervention in addition to the target intervention that contributed to the result. So for example, it could be that the patient or family's own pastor or outside counseling or the support of the nurses helped move the patient and the care plan along to both discern what the patient's values were, but also then to align the care plan with it, right? Maybe the patient and family did their own processing along the way without the chaplain, right? Could the shift or this movement have occurred if the chaplain hadn't been involved? We don't know, we'll never know, right? There could have also been what I call a super rival, right? Some other force larger than, but including the intervention of the chaplain that accounts for the results. So one of the things that we do see in these cases is that the sicker a patient gets, sometimes the more willing they are to accept reality. And that there's often an inverse relationship between goals of care, between aggressive or palliative focus of care, and where the patient is on their course of their illness. And so patients' values actually shift along the way. Their goals shift in relationship to how sick they are and to their ability to come to terms with this. This is called a super rival, right? So it may not just be the patient, the chaplain who was at work, but we can at least tie the chaplain's interventions into these other forces to come up with an explanation for how it is that value concordant care happens when the chaplain is involved. I'm going to stop there looking at our book, and I want to shift for a moment and talk about using cases for theory building. This is another way that we can use multiple cases again. So we tested a couple presuppositions or a couple propositions in my last example. Now we're going to use multiple cases to kind of generate a theory, and our colleague Steve Nolan has begun to do that for us. If you have not read his chapter in the Dutch case study book, please do. It's just a remarkable example of this. So he analyzed multiple case studies and found that they both confirm and confound a reigning presupposition that chaplaincy care is delivered by religious professionals and therefore is a religious interventions. He also identified in his multiple case study analysis that chaplain-patient therapeutic alliance actually is an intervention, and it allows interventions to work in and through this relationship. So he provides a new idea, right, from all of these, that chaplaincy care has the form of psycho-spiritual therapy. It both looks like psychotherapy and it has unique characteristics. And this is how he is, to quote his article, building toward a theory of chaplaincy care, a model, a theory of what chaplaincy care is, right, by using case studies. Thank you, Steve Nolan, for that work. It's not the last word on the project, however, so lots more can be done here. So if you want to engage in multiple case study research, I just want to say this as a warning, right? Collaborate with experts. You need to have people who teach courses in your social science departments, in your universities, your anthropologists, people who have some methodological rigor and may be willing to contribute their expertise. Because as you can see, I've listed a few of these potential confounding moments, right, in doing this. How many case studies are you going to compare when you do your multiple case study research? Why would you choose 3 instead of 10? Are the cases that you're choosing to look at representative of the topic at hand? Are they paradigmatic? Are they outliers? Are they the critical case, right? Are you doing a purposive sampling in order to, again, kind of complete this conceptual framework or the research question? Do you have cases present, or even do we have them developed yet, that call into question the patterns that are emerging? Because those are, again, some of those outliers. If we're going to generate theories or say this has some larger generalizability, right, we need to also consider cases that might challenge our theory. And again, based upon expert knowledge, what might be missing as you perhaps create a multiple case study? Do they exist already? Are there gaps in our knowledge from what we're seeing as we're trying to answer a specific question within the existing cases? So we need to go get some more. And then again, who gets to decide what's included and excluded, right? Do we just include our own perspective, or are we going to include the perspective of the actors? That is, perhaps even seek some of our patient input, perhaps seek the veterans who are in the illustration I'll show you shortly being included in a case study project and having cases written about them so we can balance out the playing field. They may have their lens on areas that we've not considered that are actually really important areas of care that chaplains provide, but again, that we just kind of missed. And then depending again upon what you're trying to find out, what the research question is, why you're approaching multiple case studies or deciding to actually create a design with multiple cases, what kind of approach are we going to use? And that will vary. So I again encourage you, if you have not already, to turn to our Dutch colleague's book, but it's just a remarkable volume. This is a chapter called Learning from Case Studies, where the military folks, the military chaplains in the Netherlands and beyond, actually have designed a multiple case study project. And they describe this whole process of they are trying to come up with a comprehensive picture of military chaplaincy. So they have to go through this process again of inclusion, exclusion, comparison, using their community of chaplains to say, what are we missing? So they came up with 5 or 6 cases, right? And they seemed like they were really good cases, but they missed some big areas that even this group said, boy, we don't have anything that speaks to this very routine thing we do. We have these outlier kind of situations, but we don't have X, Y, and Z. How can we say that this set of cases represents the kind of bounded question or bounded phenomenon of the role of chaplains in the military, of military chaplaincy? We can't yet. So again, I'll not say a whole lot more, except that it's thoughtful, it's intentional, it's rigorous, and it is an incredible contribution to the work we're doing. So I'm going to stop there, cough for a moment, and then say, returning back to where Cate started, there are many opportunities to do multiple cases. There are published case studies that you could already begin to take a look at, and we could develop some new collections of multiple cases with some, again, strategic design of what the purpose of these cases are and what methods we're going to use to analyze multiple case studies in conversation with one another or with other cases that are there. So one of the questions that we have been wanting to answer has to do with spiritual distress and theodicy. Do the theodicies present in these 4 cases I've listed, these are just 4, confirm or confound our existing models? What is it that the chaplain does that actually alleviates spiritual distress, that addresses the problem, as it were, of theodicy in patient care? These are 4 bounded cases that can begin to direct us to answer that question. But again, they may not be sufficient to look at the current models of theodicy, right, that are out there and say, are these sufficient? So for example, do we have one of patients who have lived in a violent setting, in an urban setting, multiple times have been subjected to what we would call to be unfair suffering, right? And then get shot and get chaplaincy care. Do our models of theodicy actually capture then that kind of, why is God doing this to me? Do patients in that situation even say that? Or do they just accept that this is the state of affairs because this is their lot in life, because this is where they grew up? So again, just one quick example and a little bit more in depth. Cate mentioned, again, the discordance between chaplain location, beliefs, and patient families. I've laid out for you 3 here. 2 of our discordant and 1 is concordant. Take a look at those 3. Make it your starting point. See what you find, right? And then all these other opportunities. And even our military chaplains, their project would ask that once they've defined military chaplaincy through a more robust set of multiple cases, right? Here's what it is, here's what we do, here's the difference it makes. We probably need to compare that with healthcare chaplaincy, with other locations of healthcare chaplaincy. And that would be another way of doing a multiple case analysis. Okay, that is where I'm going to leave you. I would like to invite you now to begin to ask and answer questions. I see we have quite a few already. I was a little late. Details of the book being referenced. We will share some of these cases with you. You'll have access to this recording and slides, to references that follow. Hopefully it will help direct you that way. So I'm not going to answer those questions.
Jeanne, there's a question here I think is really key. Shay Green has asked, I'm curious if other disciplines ask permission of the patients to publish a case study. Is that something that just chaplains are doing, or are there examples of that from other professions' case studies?
Yes. So what do we know? It depends, right? So where we got our guidelines and our ethical guidelines for case studies really came, I would say, primarily out of the field of psychology and psychiatry, because they are also dealing with areas of care that are very sensitive in nature, where there are lots of concerns about privacy and confidentiality, right? Larger case studies, so somebody observing a classroom of teachers and children, that's a larger research project where there may be the requirement through an IRB for certain kinds of permission or consent, but probably not from the children themselves, right? Because the level of de-identification may be greater when you're doing, again, kind of more, I don't even know what to call it, rather than one-on-one case studies, this person, this chaplain, larger group observations as your data for case studies. So it depends, but yes, there's always some attempt to protect the privacy, confidentiality of our patients and families and honor who they are. But again, for chaplains, we have even, I think, a stronger mandate within our ethics to promote dignity and respect and to be careful about boundaries and seek approval.
Absolutely. I do think that our patients approach us with a somewhat always unspoken assumption of confidentiality. And so that is maybe a little bit different than just medical details that patients know are in the chart. A little bit differently. And we're all wrestling with this with open notes right now and some other aspects of how we share our care. There's a great question that's a follow-on for this, and I know you mentioned the IRB. Emily asks, do you need a written consent form when you discuss the case study with a patient or their loved ones? Or did you document verbal consent? And I would add to that kind of the whole role of the IRB in case studies, or lack of the role of the IRB, and different ways of exploring that.
Yeah, so I would call it lack of the IRB. Case studies as one-offs, right? Or even as a collection of bounded cases like we did, don't need IRB approval. So did we have a written consent form? We actually did for cases where we had access to patients and families. We asked for their explicit consent. My case, my family actually edited my case, went through and provided like written edits, not just to content, but to grammar, in addition to that. But many of the cases were situations that chaplains had encountered 3 or 5 years ago, and they no longer had access. So again, that's where that de-identification comes in, right? So again, I think if you're, I love Cate's project where you're starting to think about with this patient and family. I think, you know, the more rigorous you can be in deciding what the agreement is going to be about how you're going to use their material. You can do a verbal consent, you can write up an agreement, right? There is no, I want to say, strict guideline for us right now. If you're doing a multiple case study project where I'm going to suggest that's when we start to need our social science colleagues and our IRB to weigh in about what level of consent we're going to need. I've often looked for research done in hospice settings. I've not found any. Is there some, and where would I go to for it? Cate, do you recall in our book whether there's any? There's one outpatient, so Jay, what's his name? One of the very first case studies that was done, he did it in an outpatient setting. Mine spans inpatient, outpatient. I know I don't remember if there's a hospice case yet.
I am not sure that there is a specifically hospice case, especially with a specifically hospice chaplain. Shelley is suggesting that it's Jay Risk is the case study writer.
Yep.
There. I am not sure if it's a specific hospice case, and if not, that is actually an area, considering the number of working chaplains who are working in hospice, there is a great need for cases written in the hospice setting. So for the person who asked that question, if you're interested in adding to the research, huge encouragement to write cases in that setting.
So we have a volunteer already, Pamela Hallmark. Woohoo! So it's about all the time we have, but what I want to do is encourage folks, if you have not, to sign up for the Chaplaincy Functions Network, unless you're wanting to join Cate's project on pediatric chaplaincy, and then join hers, right? And that's where we will conduct some or provide the opportunity for chaplains interested in this area of research to connect, right? You can also reach out to Cate and I, to people who have provided their names here as interested in that. Pamela Hallmark, you can share your addresses with one another. We will be sending out the slides. Certainly we hope that this has spawned interest in continuing to do more of this work. So don't hesitate to reach out to Transforming Chaplaincy, to any one of us involved in this project, and we can hopefully connect you with one another. I'm not sure about how we are to respond or go about the IRB rule. Yes, I know. You will have an independent IRB at your institution. Again, I would say if you are doing a one-off case study, you do not need IRB approval. Anything beyond that, I'm going to suggest you reach out to your IRB and to colleagues who know how to negotiate that process.
The IRB usually has a contact person, and they will be very helpful in helping you delineate what kind of approval your own project would need, and your own manager may also have information about your specific institution.
Great. Thank you so much for our time. Thank you, Cate, for collaborating, and thanks to Transforming Chaplaincy. We're really, really excited to continue to promote chaplaincy care through research, and we hope that you will join us.
Thanks, everybody.
Blessings on your day.